welcome. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hutchins. I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Association of Nonprofits. I am so delighted to be with all of you this June morning in Maine. I'm so glad that you all have decided to come and hear a little bit about leadership transition. I do want to let you know that this recording will be available soon, so you can share it with others. And we also encourage people to continue introducing themselves in the chat box and to ask questions. We really would love to have you ask questions. We also have many of our staff. Anna is our membership manager. Kelly is our development and marketing manager, who are, if you want to ask any questions privately, you're also welcome to chat them directly. Okay. My name is Jennifer Hutchins, Executive Director of the Maine Association of Nonprofits. I'd like to first thank our sponsors, who really are very important in making it possible for us to bring the nonprofit community the services that we do for you. And this morning, they're Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare and Eaton Peabody. And one thing I wanted to mention about Eaton Peabody as a legal firm based in Bangor and in Portland. We do have for MANP members a pro bono benefit of being able to ask legal questions. We offer through our various legal partners. We have a 30-minute pro bono benefit each year. It's done on an annual basis. So if that's something you want to look into, please check that out if you are a member of the Maine Association of Nonprofits. Thank you again to Harvard Pilgrim and Eaton Peabody. They're tremendous partners and supporters of MANP. Okay, to kick us off with this topic this morning, I just wanted to make a couple of notes to put us into context. So I've been professionally working in the Portland and Maine area since 1995. And as far as I can remember, having received my master's degree in public policy and management from the Muskie School, some of you may have been around during that time, and you know about Professor Charlie Colgan, who was the Maine state economist back in the day. And Charlie was one of my professors. And Charlie introduced me to this concept of, which sounds very doom and gloom. And now if you're a Game of Thrones follower, it's particularly scary. But he introduced me to this phrase, a demographic winter, that we have known demographically for a long time nationally, but also particularly in Maine, how our demographics were going to be challenging for us as the baby boomer generation retired and the Gen X generation that literally had fewer people in that generation, that as that leadership transition happened, there would be a gap in who was going to fill key leadership positions. And the Maine Association of Nonprofits has been following this for many, many years. And leadership transition is something that we take very seriously, because we have seen the research about the regional challenges in New England. We have seen studies about not only is there a need for leaders to fill some of these gaps that we knew were coming, but it also lacked a lot of diversity. And that was another issue that we've been really focusing on. And then of course, 2020 hit, and people started talking about the resignation, the great resignation of people taking the pandemic as a time to reflect and think about what they wanted to do with the rest of their lives, or needed to really think very seriously, given the fact that there were so many new pressures and unique challenges being put on every segment of our economy. But I would argue, in particular, the nonprofit sector, given how much strain, resources, and demand was up, as well as resources were harder to come by, or is getting more confusing as to how to access them. And so these combined factors of already literal demographic numbers, asking ourselves who's going to fill the seats of the leaders of today, as well as the unique shifts and challenges that came to us from 2020 have really emerged us into what I've been reading a nautical history book. So my analogy for today is an extremely turbulent sea of leadership and who's doing what, and how are people reallocating their energy, and who's moving to what position, and how do they want to contribute to the nonprofit sector? What are they able to contribute, given that we've seen so much burnout, there's and other challenges, and so it's a turbulent sea out there. And so the one thing I want to begin with before I introduce my first guest, and which I'm going to do in just 2 seconds, is to say MANP's been following this issue for a long time, and we have a whole section on our website called about leadership transitions. And I know Kelly or Anna is going to put the link to that in our thank you, Kelly, in the chat. And I really encourage you to take the time to look through that, because one of the really key things for us about leadership transition is we want to get the point across to our nonprofit colleagues that leadership transition, while especially if it's unexpected, can be extremely stressful. Now, whether it's planned or not, it's a stressful time because it's about change. And it can be framed as a tremendous opportunity to really take a step back and really think about your organization from a higher level or a more vision perspective, and to really reflect on where you're standing in your organizational development and where you want to go moving forward, and then what kind of leadership is necessary for you to achieve those goals. And we really encourage organizations to be prepared for leadership succession, even if you're not anticipating one in the next few months or years, that there are things you can do now to prepare for an easier time, which again is going to be stressful for no matter what. And so that's really the focus of today, is we've brought on 4 leaders in our community who have gone through a leadership transition. Each one of them is slightly different. And I'm hoping that they will pique your interest, provide you with a few tips to get you thinking. But I want you to know that MANP has your back. And we, again, MANP members have access to our help desk, and everyone has access to the resources on our website. And we encourage you to, we're not going to cover it all today. Okay, with that, now you've listened to me talk enough. Now let's talk to the people who've really gone through it very recently. And I'm going to start with Rebecca Hatfield. Rebecca is the director of Avesta Housing. And thank you so much, Rebecca. It's great to see you here. How are you doing this morning?
Great. Thank you for having me.
I'm so honored that you came this morning, because I know I seeing you out in the community. I know that you are all over the place doing really important things, especially because it does seem like housing these days is probably certainly at the top of the list, right?
Yeah.
So thank you for taking the time. I'm going to dive right in and ask you, in your case, you transitioned from within the organization to take over for someone who had been in the role for a number of years. And I wondered if you could just reflect for a few minutes about the advantages of that. What are the benefits of being able to do that? But then what are some of the things that may have surprised you? So benefits first, and then what might have surprised you, maybe been a little bit more challenging that you didn't expect, or maybe you did expect?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And just a little bit of context, I had been with Avesta for 7 years when I stepped into the CEO role. I was the successor to a 22, 23-year CEO, and I stepped in 2022, which was just coming out of the pandemic. So it was a huge transition for our employees, and at the peak of the housing crisis. So when you said it can be turbulent and stressful, that probably was an understatement for my transition. But here we are today. So to answer your questions, I think that there's to start with kind of the benefits, and then second, what's surprising. I think there's 3 things that are benefits, and then a couple of things that I had kind of going in my favor. The 3 benefits are, number 1, I had knowledge and expertise of the organization. So even though there was still a learning curve because there's a change in role, and I had served as a senior vice president for several years, so I knew the board and knew the organization very well. I knew the business, the team, the operations, the strategies and goals, and the industry trends. I had a great idea of the strengths and weaknesses and threats and opportunities, and that was definitely an advantage, even though there was a learning curve in the change of the role. I think what was most important advantage is that I had established credibility with the team and the employees and the board. So assuming you had good relationships prior, and I think I did, you kind of have inherent trust from the people around you, which goes a long way if you respect that trust and you handle it delicately and you continue to invest and build it. And the third thing is partners and relationships. I had established trust for many of our partners and all of our relationships. They knew me, they had worked with me for several years. And in fact, I had an opportunity to leverage some of that familiarity that they had with me to kind of bring in newness and reset some relationships and do some great work on that front. So I think those were the benefits. And then the things I had going for me is that I had someone who had worked for me for 5 years. So I had a successor for my prior role, and he could step right in and I could make the transition. So that wasn't really on my plate. I still had to lean in, but he had seen the team for 5 years and really could take that off my plate so I could transition. And I had a very, very strong and executive team. In fact, none of them have turned over since I've stepped in. And they rallied around me. They were allies. We navigated the changing dynamic from peer to supervisor very, very well. And I really leaned on them as, this is me stepping in and we're leading this organization together. So that's what I think the strengths are. To answer your question around what surprised me, despite all that, I think there's no questions. There's moments of stress in a transition. You're drinking from a fire hose, and it felt like that was never going to stop. And you kind of have to take it you need to find allies, seek support, take it one day at a time. But I think what surprised me most is the thing that I said was most important, that people knew me. The biggest challenge and the thing that surprised me is that people knew me. And so when it comes to because people know you, they have expectations and assumptions around how you're going to do certain things when you transition. And so when you have to approach something a little bit differently because you're looking through a different lens, or you have broader considerations as the ED or a CEO, that can be something that's surprising to people, right? It doesn't mean that your mindset isn't the same or that you're leading differently. It just means that you have to look and take different considerations when you make decisions. And I kind of handled it like you have to be aware of that. You have to walk that line very carefully. And I think you have to be transparent and over communicate to handle that trust delicately and help people understand why you're going to navigate things differently.
That's great. Yeah, that's such a good point. So many times our challenges turn out, they're two sides of the same coin. It just occurred to me one question I wanted to ask you, Rebecca, and I apologize. I don't think we gave this one to you in advance, but it's given the fact that you said that you stepped into a role and then you had someone who was able to step into your role. I guess I'm curious about how much your team was preparing for this kind of thing. Meaning, we try to encourage people to remember that leadership preparation for leadership succession really begins with working with your existing team and thinking about who it might be stepping into a different role. And I wondered how deliberate that was, or was it just sort of kind of magical that you all ended up being able to support each other as the roles were shifting?
Yeah, what's interesting is as an executive team, or I think as a leadership team, we didn't talk about succession a lot. I think succession planning was obviously happening for obvious reasons, but me as a manager and a leader always has succession on my mind, even though it may not be top of mind at the broader conversation. And so when I manage a team, I'm always thinking about who's going to follow me, and I should be bringing the high potential people up one day. If I'm not training my team to eventually step in and take my job, then I'm not doing my job. And so I had deliberately, kind of made sure that our high potential people were exposed to the team and knew that they could step in, because if I didn't become CEO, there was no guarantee I was going to be there forever. And you want to make sure that there is succession and a plan. And also you operate much better when you have people who can lead your team outside of you. And
Right.
so I think it's really, really important to be thinking about that no matter what level you are at in the organization.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, thank you, Rebecca. I know this is such a short, brief period of time, but that you've given us already so much good tips to think about. And I just want to say thank you again for joining us, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
I'm going to bring on a team next. I think a lot of people know Ann Heroes, who was the former CEO of the Center for Grieving Children, and the new director, Gretchen Johnson. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
How are you doing this morning?
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. Good morning, Ann. I'm going to start with you, Ann. How did you prepare for your retirement, and what were some of the challenges you thought about in your leadership succession, having led the organization for so many years, such a prominent organization doing such incredible work in our community? How did you prepare, and what were some of the potential challenges that you prepared yourself for?
Well, good morning, everyone. I think you're doing a great job, Jennifer. This is a great opportunity for all executive directors to stay connected throughout the state, and I think that is so important. My background and connection to the center started very early as a former family, and then also aligning a lot with what Rebecca just said about taking over from the first ever executive director, and myself kind of being an insider taking over the position. So I had learned a lot there, but then also, wondering when would I be ready to retire? And that was not an easy thing to comprehend. But I think I asked a few friends, and they said, well, you'll know when you know. And I'm like, okay, that's great. That's really insightful. But anyway, it was so true. Having gone through the COVID experience and running the organization through that, which, as some of you I'm sure know, that we were the third center in the US, and we operate totally with volunteers. So it's a very unusual model to run. And so I was thinking about that. But during COVID, everything, as you mentioned earlier, had to be reassessed. How we provided our programming, how we worked remotely, all of that, and of course, funding. So I guess I thought I might stay longer in the position, but after going through COVID, it was a lot to carry. And so I felt I was ready. Now, in preparing for that, I wanted to be sure that I had the team in place, which included a program director who needed to retire. So that in turn bumped, things for me. But what was highest in my mind was that we would set it up for success. And that was so important to me, having been the second executive director at the center. So no pressure on Gretchen here as she listens, but putting things in place, getting the board on board in terms of it being ready. And I think that's maybe another conversation for another day, but how they would take it on. And it is a lot of work. So not only on my side in terms of getting them ready and having everything internally in place, there was also bringing them to the place of understanding that it was time for change. And we all can be replaced, but the important thing is that we set it up for success. In getting that process in place, it was also important for me to consider the volunteers, because if they were not going to be comfortable with the new leadership, it was going to be, a struggle. And again, wanting things to be a success. So helping the board put a framework in place that was going to be, voices would be heard, voices would be respected, and then also the search committee and all of that. So in terms of, you know, the day-to-day and getting ready, I try to do as best I can. I'm sure I didn't do enough, no matter what, in terms of crossover with a new executive director. You know, 2 weeks is not a lot, but I did make it sure that I would be available. And you know, my way of structuring things might be different than how the new person was, and I'm sure Gretchen will speak to that in a few minutes. But so the day-to-day part of it, getting the staffing ready, everybody ready. Then also thinking about the board composition. I had been thinking about that a couple of years earlier, and I was setting up the idea who the people would be that I might want on the board. And to me, having people with a background in personnel, whether they were a lawyer or whether they were, you know, worked in this kind of work, it was important to have some of their voices on the board, and that we would lean on them for leadership through this. I think that went very well.
And I have one quick question for you. We asked the folks who registered for some questions in advance, and did your board consider an interim executive director before going to the search?
No, and it wasn't something I felt to me, that would be, I know I was pretty unusual in that I had plenty of time to play with. I did not want to have an intern, and I don't think they did either, because I was willing to stay around and be in place.
Right. You had done so much prior planning that you were really ready. An interim
Yes.
executive director can be a really good solution, particularly if a board isn't quite as ready as they think they are, and they don't have the opportunity to do some of that pause and reflection in advance. And so I just appreciate someone raising that issue, because I think sometimes we get so anxious to get someone in there and to fill the role, especially as board leaders, that we forget that an interim ED can be an option. So I just wanted to point that out. Hey, Gretchen, I'd love to bring you in here. And Anne, I apologize. I'm always so sensitive to the fact that I don't have enough time with each of you. So I appreciate everybody's patience with that, because each of you could have so much to give. But I want to give Gretchen a chance to say too about how about you? What were some of the things that you were thinking about Anne sort of already mentioned it a little bit, is filling shoes of a leader who obviously had built and had contributed to an organization that was so prominent in our community.
Yeah, so you know, I had been part of the center in previous years as a volunteer and as a board member. So even though I was coming in sort of, I think, in an unusual circumstance where I had never worked in a nonprofit before, I came in sort of with corporate experience. I did hear the metaphor a lot about, oh, well, you know, Anne's been there so long, everyone knows Anne, everyone associates Anne so much with the mission and with the organization, and, you know, the big shoes to fill metaphor. But fortunately, what I've found is that the staff and board and the community have all been very open to letting me wear my own shoes and find my own path to my own style of leadership, but in a way that is really mission focused and really kind of stewarding the organization. You know, I think the challenges that I had, like Rebecca said, sometimes the challenges are the other side. I think you said, Jennifer, the other side of the opportunity, where being so familiar with Anne as the leader of the organization, it gave me so much comfort, because I knew sort of where the expectations were. I knew a lot of just the language, the cultural nuance that helped me step in. And you know, I think the challenge I faced was not, I had to sort of resist the urge to hit the ground running. The board had been very deliberate in the hiring process. People had known that Anne was going to be retiring. So this wasn't urgent. This wasn't a rushed process. But because I was so eager to get going, I wanted to just like jump in and start doing all the things. And I had to sort of resist that urge. And really what I ended up doing was taking a lot of time just to get to know the people here, one-on-one meetings, getting to visit each night of service, getting to introduce myself to the volunteers, just helping people transition their notion of Anne as the sort of heart and soul of the organization to the fact that this can be, that the legacy of the mission and the organization can be stewarded forward. And that it's not just about me, it's about really staying true to the work.
Yeah, that's so true. You're reminding me, Gretchen, about my own transition, taking over from a leader 8 years ago who had been at the organization for 14 years. And this I wanted to share just because I want to offer listeners some tips that you might not think about. And so I would love to have each of you share a thing that you could share, maybe something you wish you had in the beginning that you didn't have or anything like that. But my one tip is that idea that you were talking about, Gretchen, of having the support of board and staff to be yourself, as opposed to feeling like you had to mimic someone who had been so successful for so long. And I was very timid about that. I admit that. And what was the most meaningful thing to me, and this has happened to me in 2 executive leadership when I've become an executive director. In both cases, a board member called me up and said, I just want to take you out to breakfast or coffee. And it's like, it's just no big deal. Just want to talk to you a little bit. In both cases. And they sat down with me. It was very early in my tenure in both cases. And they in both cases, they wanted to assure me that they hired me for my attributes, not to do what had been done exactly for the past 14 years. And it took me back a little bit because replacing someone who's been so successful, it's like, well, the last thing I want to do is to try point out that why are we doing things this way? And it was so meaningful for me to have a board member give me permission to ask questions and try things differently. And so that's my tip, is that if you happen to be a board member of an organization, or you want to prepare for a succession, encourage a board member. It's so powerful when it comes from a board member who takes you and says, listen, we hired you for your attributes, and we know the organization is in a position where it can explore a different style of leadership, and different leadership styles are important for different times of the organization's development. And it doesn't mean that the prior director wasn't entirely perfect at that time, but change is good and we trust you. So what you were saying, Gretchen, really pointed out to me how meaningful those conversations were. And before I introduce our next guest, what would be one thing that you sort of, upon reflection, a tip that you'd like to share, or something you wish you had that might have been supportive?
Well, I just felt it went as well as I could possibly have thought through this. I thought a lot about this, and as you mentioned earlier, that this is a big time for change in leadership, and I've been watching what had been happening in other organizations. So I felt I was pretty prepared. I think the part that maybe is, was a surprise to me is, how do I cope in retirement, having been, morning, noon, and night, thinking about, the organization. So that is still left to play out. I have spent, it's 3 months this week, actually. And I've spent a lot of time traveling and whatever, renewing my Irish accent and some other things. So
don't ever lose that, Anne. Please don't ever lose that.
So it's all been very much play at the moment, and so enjoying every moment of it. Absolutely, that's a surprise, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and Anne, I've heard that from retiring CEOs, and there's an opportunity for us to just bring together retiring CEOs and have a conversation about how do you transition from such an intense giving time where you were doing so much to care for community. So thank you so much for that. What about you, Gretchen? Do you have a tip for people who might be in a similar situation to you?
I have an observation and a tip. One thing I wanted to make sure I shared today is that, I think I was a little surprised at how incredibly transferable all the skills that I had were. I was nervous coming into nonprofit work for the first time, thinking I was going to somehow feel out of my depth in certain areas, but it was remarkable. So I encourage anyone on this call, if you are facing challenges or thinking about hiring, or hiring is a challenge, definitely consider looking outside of the nonprofit sector, because I was surprised at how many experiences and work skills fit perfectly into this new role. Maybe just requiring a little bit of, fine tuning. But I would say the advice that I would have, though, would be surround yourself with people who know more than you do, and not just in your staff. Trust your staff, but because I'm very lucky to have people here who I can trust to just do what I know they need to do, and I can stay out of their way and not worry about knowing how to do what they do better than them. But also I've had a lot of great one-on-one meetings with other executive directors. That was one of my first priorities too, was to get to know the community better, get to know more executive directors of nonprofits, whether their work is aligned or separate, or someone whose maybe career trajectory was close to mine, or someone who is working in an area that's aligned with our mission. And I've just gotten so much wisdom and so much support, and just great advice, great book recommendations, great resources. So that the executive director community is amazing.
Thank you, Gretchen. Yeah, that was another thing that was really useful to me, as I created a peer group they've remained a very trusted group of people for myself. So that's a really excellent tip. Everything you guys have shared is really wonderful. Thank you so much for your time this morning. And I hope you guys have a great weekend. The next person I want to introduce is Bruce King. He is the new executive director of Maine Boys to Men. Right? How are you doing this morning, Bruce?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on this.
How are the Red Sox doing?
Not great, but
but well, let's talk about the Celtics.
So, yeah,
exactly. You should have your Celtics hat on.
Yeah.
Bruce, I would love to talk to you a little bit about your transition. You have a really interesting, you had an experience prior to Maine Boys to Men where you actually were in a co-director role. And that's one area that we've really been exploring in the nonprofit sector, because we do know that we need to be open to how we're structuring how this important work gets done in our community. And some organizations are choosing the co-director model. And so I wanted you, if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about that. What did it feel like to transition from a co-directorship into a full-time ED role?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. And really, it is a lot of what kind of put me in the position of pursuing this particular role. I have a lot of thoughts about the co-director model, a lot of them good, a lot of them, recognizing the challenges that it presents. So I'd love to have that conversation in depth with people. But I recognize that in that there were certain deficits, because that was my first role in an executive leadership model at all. So I recognize, in order for me to develop the skills that I had kind of not developed, because when you're in a co-directorship, you really lean into your strengths. And so with Margot Fine, I had just this incredible individual who had all of the strengths in the areas where I had deficits. And I recognized, in order to grow, I needed to be in a place that was going to throw me into the deep end a little bit. So it was a very much a conscious decision. It's like, okay, in order for me to progress in my life, I'm going to have to, throw myself to the wolves a little bit.
Yeah, I understand that. So how did you prepare for your transition to Maine Boys to Men? And it's similar to what I've asked the others. Were there things that surprised you that might be useful for other people to hear about?
Yeah, I mean, so you'd mentioned earlier the interim model, and I'll say that was what I stepped into with Maine Boys to Men.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and so that was really interesting, because I've spent a lot of my first 3.5 months meeting with a lot of different individuals, doing a lot of groundwork. And with the interim, they weren't able to really hand over the relationships in the same way that a more long-term ED would have been able to. And so given that the ED role is such a relationship-driven role, there's a bit of a challenge there. That said, the interim individual did an amazing, amazing job of just keeping things moving, working on all of the nuts and bolts of the organization, the insurance components, all of the admin things. I mean, we're a 4-person team here. It's we all have to do a little bit of everything. So it was great to have that individual in that space, and at the same time, I've gone back and met with the 2 previous EDs to really kind of pick their brains. And I found that that's really important to have that relationship so that I can get some more of the institutional memory of the organization.
One of the questions in the chat, which I think is really interesting. I know Anne said that her transit, how long does the executive director stick around? In your case, how did that work? And would you have any different recommendations for how that could work?
I mean, it's, in nonprofits, unfortunately, I think the reality is a lot of decisions are influenced by budget and budgetary issues, and that
Right.
includes the overlap. We
Right.
only had about 2 weeks of overlap.
Yep.
And so I think we handed off as much relationship as we could. I was fortunate in that the interim was somebody who had been on the board previously and is now back on the board, so they're still within arm's reach, but I'd say 2 weeks is pretty short. And so if you can give a little bit more grace period and you're able to factor that into your budget when you're, laying those things out, depending how long you have to make that decision, I encourage people to, lay as much groundwork as possible for a long runway. I also stepped in when our program director was stepping out, and I had about a month of overlap with him, I think. And so I was getting a lot of the memory from him. But when he stepped out, one of the gifts is that I was able to hire a new program director with similar goals and similar thoughts around the mission. And in some ways, that's great. You get a new blank slate. But in other ways, once again, you lose that kind of institutional memory that's really important to hand off, as well as the relationships.
Yeah, that's great. That is, I noted that you said that you had access to talking to the prior executive directors, which is so valuable. You bring up a really good point, Bruce. I think that in my experience, sometimes, in the nonprofit sector, we have to be really careful to respect people's time. And I'm actually on a board right now, and there's a planned transition happening, and we were debating at the board, the executive director, the departing CEO wanted to say, I'm just available, I'll just volunteer, like call me whenever you want, right? And we've decided as a board and again, we're fortunate enough to have the resources to be able to compensate him for his time. But it's not just about compensating for him for his time, which we think is really, really important for the sector to do, is to start acknowledging that people's time has value, and we need to think hard about that and not just keep thinking of it as like this volunteer effort all the time. But it's also because it creates a clearer boundary. Because it also sometimes, and I think probably many of us on this call have talked about how you can, as someone who's leaving, you can have really good intentions of wanting to be helpful. But it can also become similar to what we were talking about with Gretchen, and myself, it can be overwhelming to the new leader because they're trying to be respectful of not stepping on toes. So I think your point about budget and planning for that, not just expecting that the executive director is going to be around, so give me a call if you need some help. Planning to have some more concrete boundaries around that, I think, can be really, really helpful. And also in terms of this idea, how long does the executive director, oftentimes than not, I find that the shorter period of time, like actually naming it, like it's either going to be 2 weeks or it's going to be 4 weeks, but not just trickle on forever, because that's when things can get kind of tricky. One thing I wanted to ask you, Bruce, is about in your, just in general, we had this question from registrants is including staff in the actual transition process. Do you have any experience with that and any thoughts?
The comment that was made earlier around over communicate, I think is key here. In terms of this new staff that I've kind of inherited in a lot of ways, well, there's not a lot of over staff. But we share an office. We're in a co-working space. We're in co-workers down here in town, Portland. And I think that that's been a huge advantage, just sharing the physical space with the other staff members. I think recognizing your communication style and how you're best to kind of be in the presence of other people. So rather than working from home, making a real intention of coming into the office, spending time with the staff and have conversations about everything. Being completely open. And some people on here have bigger staff, so that's not possible. Leaning into electronic communication, making sure that there's regular emails, those sorts of structures. But yeah, I think it's really important to bring your staff along and recognize who is leadership, who are the people coming in, what are the ideas. Maine Boys to Men is 25 years old, and we've been through a lot of different iterations. We've had slightly different focuses over time. And so, recognizing that with new staff, myself and the director, the program director, is that we're likely to see a slight shift in how we do things. And in that, there is likely to be a slight shift in the traditional mission. And if the rest of the staff isn't aware of that and they've been moving in a given direction for so long, you can really lose people along the way. And so over communicate. I think that that's a major point here that seems to be stringing along the entire conversation today. And I think that that's really the best way to kind of, shift leadership and shift expectations of what people are hoping to accomplish.
That's great. Thank you very much, Bruce. That is a great place to wind up on is we're talking about planning, communicating. The other thing I want to highlight that a number of our guests have talked about is relationship building. That when you become the new executive director, you definitely can feel the fire hose, as Gretchen mentioned. And she talked about taking the time, and Bruce, you too, in terms of making sure people are in person, having conversations, that is invaluable to giving yourself the chance to develop those relationships, developing that trust and that line of communication is a part of that ED transition that is so useful to getting off the ground. Thank you again, Bruce, for your time. I encourage people to get to know Maine Boys to Men if you're not familiar with it. As Bruce said, it's been around for 5 years, you said, Bruce, and doing some really great work. And I know that Bruce, as a leader in our community, is going to bring a really fresh perspective. And so I'm excited to see what you do with the organization, Bruce. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Well, everybody, once again, we just introduced a topic and boom, we just skirted right across the top of it. But seeing your questions in chat, seeing how many people wanted to talk about this and seeing the great insights from the leaders who joined us this morning, there's clearly so much to dive into here. And I want you to be reassured that MANP has your back, and we want to be helping our organizations deal with these issues. And we already have so many so many resources. This is the time for me to plug our Executive Transitions Toolkit. When I did become the executive director 8 years ago, the organization decided to actually track the transition process. And so we have a toolkit that includes how we went through that process. And so I encourage you to check that out. It's been linked in the chat by Kelly. And we're also going to be updating that toolkit over the next several months, which I'm excited about. So stay tuned for that to update new resources. The other thing I want to say is that check out our resources, check out the leadership transition page. If there are things that aren't on there that you would like to see. Again, as members of MANP, everyone has access to our help desk, and we have such knowledgeable staff here. It blows my mind every day. And so if there are things that you could use that you're not seeing immediately on our website, please reach out. We have our learn at, we have info at, but we also have individuals here who are ready to support you. So please reach out and let us know. We are coming up on our last minute, so I've got to do my last minute of closing. Thank you again to our sponsors, Harvard Program Healthcare and Eaton Peabody. One thing I wanted to mention is that in August, we haven't nailed down the exact date, but just something to keep in mind. The first week in August, we're going to host a meetup somewhere in Portland for executive directors, because as Anne said, as Gretchen said, we find that people who are in leaders who are in a similar role benefit so much from connecting with one another. So stay tuned for that. A meetup for nonprofit executive directors and leaders. We are going to have it in the Portland area this time, but we encourage you to take advantage of that. And then our next MANP Connects is going to be on September 13th. And this time, the topic is going to be fair access to financial resources. And we're going to be talking about co-ops and CDFIs, which are community development financial institutions, and talking about how different communities accesses the resources that they need to be successful nonprofits. So we encourage you to check out that topic. And oh, look at that. Is the link to register going to be in the chat box? That's what it says right there. And so in any case, great to see you all. Ooh, it's 9:46. I gotta let you go. I'm so grateful to see all of you. Have a wonderful summer weekend. Hello, summer. Go Celtics. No, it's over. Anyway, bye.